If you're drawing fur like this, but want to be learning how to draw fur like this, then you're in the right place. I'm going to start off by showing you why fur like this can happen with pastel pencils and where you're going wrong, and then I'm going to show you the best techniques to use so that you can improve every drawing you do. All of your materials are listed below, as is the reference photo link, which is on Unsplash from Giorgio if you want to go and find that. Okay, let's get cracking. When I see people drawing fur and they're not quite sure what to do, there are a couple of things that are usually going wrong all at once. So the first one has to be the underpainting. So with the underpainting, it's either not there at all, or it's quite patchy, as I'm going to demonstrate now, and there is a lot of the tooth of the card usually left showing through. Obviously, conversely, there are people that fill it in so much that you can't get another layer on top and therefore you can't draw the fur properly. But I'd say more often than not, this is what I'd see, a very patchy underpainting. And usually the underpainting isn't put in dark enough, or it's put in too dark, but either way there is a problem with it. Generally speaking, it isn't put in dark enough though. So I'm just going to finish off, purposely make a few lines. I'm going to not follow the direction, and we end up with something that's a bit messy, a bit patchy, and not really very well filled in. And then straight from there, they're probably looking at the colour of fur, which really is too light. So instead of building up the layers, they're going to go straight to the lightest colours. So this Bister isn't even going to really show up. That's partly because of the type of pencil this is. But I'll put down a few layers of one colour, and then deciding that it's not light enough and not really realising that it's because they've not worked up to those lighter tones, immediately start going in with a pencil that is far too light. To be honest, usually I would see someone going in with a white, but for this, I'm going to go in with the ivory. Now, most people do exactly as I'm doing now and literally hit the page as they're drawing them. And you can see you end up with these sort of bobbly marks at the start. The next thing is that people tend to draw their fur in one row. And I'll hold the pencil straight down, and by holding it straight down, the marks get thicker and thicker. And then they'll go for another row. Now, sometimes people realise, oh, I'm drawing all of this fur in straight lines, and fur isn't in straight lines. So, after having put a few rows in and not being quite happy with it, then people start to go a little bit too far and literally start crisscrossing things. Now, I know this looks like it's being exaggerated, but this is what I see in classes, and it makes sense. People are trying to figure out how to get these marks down. But by pressing too hard like this, the fur is getting thicker and thicker. It's very rigid looking. It's not following the form, so we're not showing bones or the muscles, or in this case we're trying to show a spherical form here, and you can see that the fur isn't following that, and our tones have been totally ignored. So we've got a brown background, which is quite patchy, followed by a very thick layer of a pencil that is just far too light, and in between that they might have used something that hasn't shown up properly because they haven't developed their tones enough. To finish this, some people, not everybody, but some people will then realise that it's not dark enough and head in with a darker pencil and literally just start drawing dark marks to try and get some form in. The problem is this is the wrong stage for adding structural shadows. As you'll see in what we're going to do next, you can add dark hairs in between your lighter hairs, but this is not the stage for adding loads of structure to your work. And this is why it looks flat, and because of the way that the hair is being laid down, it doesn't look like it's natural or moving. So let's go on to the correct way to draw your fur. If we look at the photo to start with, we can see that there are some of these tones and colours in there, so that's good. However, they didn't start off dark enough. So we're going to pretend that this is a 3D ball that we are colouring in here. I'm going to start off with the 177 for this, and I'm going to use my pencil on the side to start with. Now this is because it gives me a really soft application of pastel, and that means I can be nice and gentle with it, and we're not going to end up with something that's patchy or has too many marks by the end. Now I'm lifting the pencil every time I'm using it. By lifting the pencil after every stroke, it's going to mean that I can blend this colour into the next one much more easily. So you could use a soft pastel block for this if you'd prefer. In small spaces, like I'm working on at the minute, it is better really to use pencils because you can be a little bit more accurate. Now I'm going to pretend the light is coming in slightly from the right hand side, so I'll have a little bit more shadow towards the left. Now you can see I am being quite light. You don't want to oversaturate the page. If you oversaturate the page too quickly, you're not going to be able to get fur details on top. This is part of the reason that you should use your pencil on the side because you get a very even pressure. From that tone, we're going to go slightly lighter, and I'm going to bring in a little bit more colour as well. Again, if you look at the photo, you can see that those medium dark tones have got quite a lot of reds in them. So we want to get a little bit of that into the underpainting. Underpaintings should not be overly detailed, but they should describe the general colours and the general tones accurately. So really, all I've done with this is blend it over the edge of the dark brown. And once again, you can see that I'm lifting the pencil off the page, and already I'm following the curvature of the ball shape too. Now with an underpainting, you never want to go too light. That is a really common issue. It's not going to support the lighter tones on top if you do. So as we get to the lighter areas, I'm going to transition into the 180. So the 180 is what I used for the what not to do, but I used it all over. I blend this over the edge of the 283. Underpaintings in general should actually be quite messy and fairly reductive. But once I've done this, I'm going to go back in with the pencils I've already used and just add a little bit more of the darker tones here and there, glazing gently over the top, being careful not to add too much pastel too quickly. So going back with the 283, I can glaze over the top of the 180 that I've just put down. So lots and lots of light layers, I haven't pressed hard, have resulted in a ball shape that is showing us some directional light, and I've followed the curvature of the ball as I've drawn it. So that would be the underpainting for this. Over the top of an underpainting, you then want to start to get lighter. In effect, we are working in reverse. So if we have a look at the photo, you can see that the top layer of fur is of course very light because this is where the light is directly hitting the fur of the dog. As we get further into the layers, the tones get a little bit richer and warmer. That's partly because the fur on the top is sun bleached, so it's not got as much colour there. And then as we get much further down, the tones become very dark and there is not a lot of colour at all, as we've seen with the 177 that we used for the deepest shadows on the ball so far. So what I like to do is pick up the pencil that I've probably already used in part of my underpainting to begin adding some fur onto the darker sections. Now this isn't going to show up super bold straight away, but we are building layers here and we never want to add too much in one go because you're going to get to the point where you can't add anything else to your page. So for this example, I'm using the 180 and I'm going to be working around the structure of this ball, making sure that I'm sweeping my pencil on and off the page instead of bashing it into the page, which is going to create these heavy marks over here. And as I work around, I twist my pencil and it helps keep it a little bit sharper than it would have been otherwise. I'm still allowing some of the underpainting to pop through. If we don't, we're not going to get any tonal contrast by the time that we're finished with our work. Remember, whenever you're working on a dog or a cat or any animal that has fur, that you need to come outside of the lines. You need to break up a hard edge. There aren't usually hard edges on these animals, only with animals that have exceedingly short fur, like a Podenco dog, for example, or a Labrador. But for most animals that have a medium to long length fur, you're going to need to bring some of that outside of the shape. But again, if we just go back to what not to do, what our amateur would end up doing is something like this. And I have seen this in work, and I completely understand why people do it. But all that happens is that instead of it looking like it's furry, it ends up looking a bit like a porcupine and quite spiky. We need instead these soft curving shapes that we build up slowly. Nothing is is done very quickly. This is going to take quite a lot longer than example A. So I bring up this pencil into this nice warm red tone that we've got down. So we're into our darker mid-tones here. At which point, of course, it's going to stop showing up because I'll be drawing back on top of the exact same pencil. Now, as you get lighter, and this is something that not a lot of teachers talk about, but it's really important, as you get lighter, you get more colour. So what I'm going to transition to is the 182. Now the 182 tonally, which is light and dark, is very similar to the 180, but this one has more colour. Generally, where there is more colour, there is more light. So I'm going to start working from around here and bring it up, and I can always add some more towards the bottom, but we want more of this towards to the top. Again, this isn't going to show up massively straight away, but all of this, if you flick between the start of the video and when this ball is finished, all of it ends up building a beautiful structure of tones and colours. And let's just pretend that there's a bit of a crown of the head, so we've got a few strands of fur that are poking out. Now you can see I'm constantly twisting my work, and I'm not doing this to annoy you. I'm doing it because it's really good practice when you're drawing to get a nice comfortable angle with your wrist. The more uncomfortable you are, the more rigid your marks are going to become, and your drawing ultimately suffers in the end. So when I'm pulling these marks out of the shape, I'm being incredibly light with my pencil. And that also means that if I'm not happy with them, I can of course rub them out fairly easily. So we've worked up some of our mid-tones, and as I've said, on camera this isn't going to show up loads, but it's adding texture. It's really important that you do these steps. It does make quite a big difference to your work in the end. Now, if we were going to be really detailed, if I was actually drawing a terrier portrait, I would also be adding some of this 283 into those dark areas around the muzzle, and that's where you can really see it. So I'm just going to pop a little bit of this in to illustrate that. And again, because tonally this is quite dark, it's not going to show up in terms of loads of individual strokes, but it is going to add more depth, and it is going to actually start to highlight some of the lighter strokes that we just put down as well. So it's almost outlining them. I think colour can be quite a daunting prospect when you're beginning drawing. But my best tip for you when you're drawing fur and want to introduce some colour is thinking about cool and warm variations. So you can see that this fur is a golden colour. If we bring up the photo again, you can see that the local colour would be effectively an orange. And if we're going to make it a little bit warmer, it's going to become red. And if we're going to make it a little bit cooler, it's going to become yellow. So then when you're picking your pencils, if we look back to our pencil selection, we have the 182, which is a golden yellowish sort of gold. We have the 283, which is a red, and then we have a Bister, which is another dull gold. We have the 180, which is incredibly desaturated. It's brown, but gives you that orange. And this is how you can start to pull and push your different colours and use them to go from darker to lighter. We can see there are more reds in the dark, so we know that more of the yellow golden tones are going to be needed in the lighter areas. It's just a nice way to start thinking about introducing colour without it being overwhelming. So once you've put in your mid-tones, and we added a little bit of that dark with the red because we can see it on our reference photo, I'm going to start to get lighter. So in this instance, I'm using the Bister. The Bister is a slightly frustrating colour to me. It's got the perfect colour for a lot of dogs with that blondie tan sort of hair. But the problem is, because it's from Cretacolor, it doesn't put down necessarily as much colour as I'd like in each stroke, because the pencil isn't as soft as a Stabilo Carbothello or indeed a Faber Castell or a Caran d'Ache. However, it is a very good colour. So if you do have just about enough supporting darker tones underneath it, it is going to show up, as you can see, but it's not going to show up quite as much as some of the other brands. When we're adding these lighter tones on top, it's very important now that you really are following the direction of fur across your subject, and think again about where the light is going to be falling on the animal's fur. In general, it's going to obviously be the top hairs, and it's going to be towards the tips as well, because the tips are often poking upwards towards the light. So this is why I'm actually starting at the tips for a lot of these, and then lifting the pencil as I work, which is giving me a nice soft transfer back into the slightly darker colours. And I'll give you a little tip in a minute for how to blend those together without losing all of your details or all of your tones as well. So I'm going to bring a little bit of the Bister down into the shadows. In general, you don't really add too many details in the shadows, but obviously this is going to show up quite nicely for us, and I will then tap it back so that it loses the intensity and it's not matched at the top. So then, as I said, what you want to do is tap up and down. Again, the amateur would probably do this and just smudge. You lose so many details doing this. It blurs all of your tones together as well. And then all that happens is you want to go back over the top and try and add them back in, and you just end up going round and round in circles until the paper won't accept any more pastel. So by tapping, it's just gently pushing the pastel into the page, but we're not losing all of our details. We're then going to want to get lighter. Now on this lovely little terrier, we've actually got a lot of very light fur. As I said, it's basically bleached by the sun, but once more, what you want to try and think about is leaving space. So we want the tooth of the card, want the underpainting to be showing through here and there. We need those honey tones to come through, and it will add depth and support these lighter hairs that we're putting on the top. And we also want to be working towards the tips. That is where they are going to be lightest, of course. And you can see as I'm working with this pencil that I am lifting it on and off the page, and it's giving me those feathery fur marks. Now you could, and I would definitely advise beginners just to practice drawing really soft fur marks on a piece of page, even without the underpainting. It's getting this sweeping motion. You're almost caressing the page and you're being ever so soft about it. You want to make sure that you move your pencil quite swiftly. If you don't move your pencil fast enough, we come back to these sorts of markings, which really aren't going to work out very well in the end. Now you can see I'm following the direction of this ball shape, and as I head into the darker areas, I'm becoming lighter with the pencil. But if you're a beginner and you're struggling with your pencil pressure, then remember you can tap, not smudge, but you can tap these marks back, and that is going to help just reduce their intensity and dull the tones and colours there. And I will probably do that anyway. Coming further down, this is where I'm going to need to tap them back a little bit, of course. You can see that we're getting a good amount of depth over this ball of fur here. Now, as I said before, I am going to go in and tap very carefully. And if you're a beginner, what you might want to do is take more breaks between each stage and tap back at the start, the beginning of each stroke, and it's just going to ensure that you're not ending up with this blotchy effect over here. So once you're done with your first pass, you've gone through all of your tones. Now it's time to go and pull out some of the contrast that we need to get a really good 3D effect. Now this is going to depend on your exact drawing, but in general, it's good to add a few more shadows. So I'm starting off with the 177, and this is what I used for the start of the underpainting. Now you can see my pencil technique here is actually a little bit different, and you'll see different people on YouTube doing it in different ways. A lot of people add it in as individual strokes. However, for wavy fur, I often start very lightly with the pencil, and I'm literally just scumbling, shading into those little pockets where I want a bit more shadow, and it's going to give us a bit more depth. Now, I'm being light with the pencil. If you're too heavy, you are going to cover up too many of the lighter strokes there. You would need to keep looking at your reference photo to ensure that you're putting the shadows into the correct place. Of course, because this is an imaginary ball of fur, I am having to make it up a little bit. So you can go in with black. For this colour of fur, I would not recommend going in with black. It's going to be too harsh. But by starting out with a pencil that is already used on the page, we know it's not going to be too harsh. It's going to be fairly harmonious with the rest of the drawing, so it's a really good place to begin. And once you've put those in, we can then make some of them even darker, and you'll see that when I do this, it's going to give me the opportunity to increase the contrast a little bit further up. So instead of going to black, I'm going to 175. This is a warm dark grey from Faber Castell. It's similar to black, but it's not got that same harshness. Now this pencil is nice and sharp, and I'm doing it in a very similar way. Lightly, very lightly, just shading in to some of those pockets of underpainting which have naturally developed over the course of the drawing. This is why it's so important to leave areas of underpainting showing through, because if you don't, you're not going to end up with depth to the fur. The fur is going to become flat instead. So I'm just going to add a little bit more with the dark brown, the 177. And because of the reference photo that we've got, I'm also just going to add a little bit of the 283, which is the red. And this is just to show you that you really should be thinking about using a variety of tones and colours as you work, and constantly referring back to the reference photo to see what there actually is in real life, and how do those tones develop into lighter or darker versions. So in this case, I know that using the red is that bridge between the really dark areas and the areas of honey colour that we can see in the dog's fur. So I'm using the 283 sort of along this band here, which is where the really dark shadow stops and we move into the lighter tones. So I'm glazing over the top of some of the shadows that I created with the dark brown. That's just tinting them a little bit towards red. It's giving me a really nice transfer from one area to the next. Now, of course, if you are a beginner, there are quite a few steps here, and you may find that your board becomes oversaturated because you're pressing a little bit too hard, in which case, absolutely do not worry about it. This is all about practice. Now I'm taking the 180 to finish here. So the 180 is the pencil I used for the first layer of so-called details, which at the start didn't look like they were doing very much, but you can see by the end, it has given me that really subtle texture and detail down in the shadows. I'm just working my way over the top of a few of those areas to make sure that the shadows I've added in don't look like they're sat on top, and we have a few hair details just feathering themselves over there. Now, any drawing, I usually go in and pick out the lightest lights before I say it's complete. Obviously, this drawing hasn't taken too long, so there's not a lot of dust that's been travelling around to dull any of these tones here. And there you have it. That is how to draw fur correctly.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it useful, and do go away and try some of these techniques because they will make a difference to your ability to draw realistic fur. If you're a beginner, try breaking the techniques down into small steps because it's quite a lot to process all at once when you're just starting out. I think it took me probably about a year to start to get to grips with learning fur when I was beginning with pastel pencils, so it does take time. Just have a bit of patience. If you want to know anything else about pastel pencils, I have a whole host of videos on my channel, from full-length tutorials to lots of little tips and tricks such as how to sharpen pastel pencils, which, if this isn't something you know how to do, it's best to learn how to do this before you try to draw learning fur. Until next time, thank you so much for watching and happy drawing.